Merry Christmas, everybody, and welcome to the Nietzsche podcast. We're going to do something a bit different for the Nietzsche podcast Christmas special this year. If you've listened to the show for a while, you probably know that in the past couple of years, we've kind of done a variety show, I guess you could say, where I have contributions from guests who have been on the show. I didn't really have time to put anything together like that this year. As many of you know, I've had some personal issues recently. I've just recently gotten back into the swing of things with the podcast, and it's been about a month since an episode had come out. I looked at the following Tuesday. I was planning to release an episode on Xiaoran, but it was Christmas Eve. So I was like, man, this is the sign that I have to do a Christmas episode anyway. So I decided to just put together a slightly shorter episode myself. And for this year, the topic is anti-Christmas. Really, that's just my way of shoehorning the topic that I came up with into a Christmas theme, because basically this isn't an anti-Christian screed or whatever. What we're going to do is sort of an extended meditation on one of the core concepts that's found in Nietzsche's most virulently anti-Christian book, The Antichrist. And this is an aspect of the Antichrist that I think doesn't get enough attention, but I think it's key to Nietzsche's whole philosophy. And the passage in the Antichrist number 14, I think is probably the best paragraph-long explication of this idea. And so, without further ado, Antichrist 14, quote, "Formerly, people thought that man's consciousness, his spirit, was a proof of his lofty origin, of his divinity. With the idea of perfecting man, he was conjured to draw his senses inside himself, after the manner of the tortoise, to cut off all relations with terrestrial things, and to divest himself of his mortal shell. Then the most important thing about him, the pure spirit, would remain over. Even concerning these things, we have improved our standpoint. Consciousness, spirit, now seems to us rather a symptom of relative imperfection in the organism, as an experiment, a groping, a misapprehension, an affliction, which absorbs an unnecessary quantity of nervous energy. We deny that anything can be done perfectly so long as it is done consciously. Pure spirit is a piece of pure stupidity. If we discount the nervous system, the senses, and the mortal shell, we have miscalculated. That is all." End quote. Now, I want to say a few words about spirit and soul, and the distinction there in theology. Soul isn't a term that is mentioned here, but Nietzsche is doing a very important reversal, and I think we'll see that as we look at this passage in the context of his broader work. Obviously, in German, the word he's using for spirit would be Geist, and that also has the connotation of intellect or mind, and we have similar linguistic associations in English. But the distinction that we have to look at, and admittedly Nietzsche doesn't really give us an indication as to whether this is on his mind or on his Geist, we might say, but I think bringing out this distinction in Hebrew is very important to understanding Nietzsche's critique here, and it is a reversal. So in the Old Testament, the term for soul, or usually translated as soul, is nephesh, which means the personal vital force, or being, the capital B, being of the individual. Whereas the term for spirit is ruach, which is etymologically connected to the terms for breath or for wind. And so, on the one hand, you have the individual soul, the nephesh, which is the self, the core of the individual, foundation of their being. We might say they're Atman in Eastern terms. And then there is the spirit, the ruach, the breath that flows through all living things. The fact that the ruach was associated with the wind is very important, or it's very elucidating, because the term spirit, ruach, could apply to the spirit that flows through human beings or the divine spirit of God. And in some sense, they're the same. Man is made in the image of God. In Christian and Jewish theology, man's sort of animated by the power of God. So the spirit is different from the soul in that it's not the core of the individual, but it is used to describe their emotional condition or their mental state. So we might speak in this sense of a spirit of courage spreading through the people, or a spirit of candor in your words, or being in good or bad spirits. We have terms like that in English today. Importantly, the ruach is where somebody's motives exist, where we might say their will or their desires exist. So in the Old Testament, God can arouse someone's spirit, that is to say, draw out of their spirit the emotional or mental realities that maybe exist only in a latent form. So, God will often do this with prophets in the Old Testament. Like maybe they have the will somewhere within their soul to go out and, preach the word of the Lord, but he has to stir a spirit of courage within them or a spirit of righteousness or something of that fashion, bring it to the fore, right? And in this way, the God of the Old Testament is, once again, much more comparable to the gods of the pagan Greeks than many would like to admit, because the Greeks also saw their own strong and uncompromising feelings and desires as the work of the gods, so to speak, as an external force acting upon them rather than something purely coming from within. And this doesn't change much in the New Testament with the introduction of Greek. I mean, the Greek word for spirit is pneuma, which carries with it, many of the same connotations. Pneuma is something moving, something flowing. It has similar associations with air and wind. If there's a significant difference, really, with how spirit is understood in the New Testament, I don't think it's so much etymological as in the fact that in the aftermath of Christ, that's when the Holy Spirit comes into the world. And so the understanding at that point is that to have the Holy Spirit within you, that's what it really means to be saved, right? That's what happens in the Christian worldview when you become part of the Church of Jesus Christ and you become a Christian, is that the Holy Spirit now dwells within you. And so what is Nietzsche doing by treating spirit as an indicator of, or as perhaps even synonymous with consciousness? Because to the extent a consciousness exists under the existing formula, we would probably locate it in the nefesh, in the individual soul, which we could then say that individual soul can become imbued with the spirit and endure in the afterlife, or not become imbued with the spirit and perish, go to the grave, go to Sheol, the place beneath the earth in the Old Testament, or meet your eternal damnation if you follow the New Testament. But if anything, that distinction is important because the spirit is where the Christian seems to locate the place of feelings, the whole world of inner desires and impulses and subconscious notions. And that's seen as being something external and distributed and sort of communal, shared with God in a way. Whereas the consciousness is that which is individual and unique to you. And so it's only if we understand those associations and the fact that there is a difference between soul and spirit in Christianity that we can begin to understand what Nietzsche is doing or what he's gesturing towards in a passage like this in the Antichrist. And to help untangle this, we're going to look at a couple other passages. One of them is from the Gay Science. This is from the Gay Science book 5, though, which means it's written within a year or so of Nietzsche writing the Antichrist, because this is appended in 87, if I remember correctly. This is from The Genius of the Species, and we've done a whole episode on that passage because it's so important to understanding this idea in Nietzsche's thought. So we have touched sort of on this idea, or an aspect of this idea. If you want to listen to a whole episode that serves as a study of that aphorism, you can look that one up. It's back in season 2. I believe it's called The Genius of the Species. But let's look at a couple of excerpts that will help us here, and I'm going to simply... I'm not going to read the whole Genius of the Species passage. It's very long. I've just picked out some extracts, and I'm not going to kind of break them up and say, and this is further down, and I'm cutting things out here. I'm just going to read the whole thing. Just consider this an abridged reading of The Genius of the Species, only the parts that are necessary to what we're talking about in this episode. So, quote, "Now it seems to me, if you will hear my answer, and it's perhaps extravagant supposition, that the subtlety and strength of consciousness are always in proportion to the capacity for communication of a man or an animal, the capacity for communication in its turn being in proportion to the necessity for communication. Granted that this observation is correct, I may proceed to the conjecture that consciousness generally has only been developed under the pressure of the necessity of communication, that from the first it has been necessary and useful only between man and man, especially between those commanding and those obeying, and has only developed in proportion to its utility. Consciousness is properly only a connecting network between man and man. It is only as such that it has had to develop. The recluse and wild beast species of men would not have needed it. In short, the development of speech and the development of consciousness, not of reason, but of reason becoming conscious, go hand in hand. Fundamentally, our actions are, in an incomparable manner, altogether personal, unique, and absolutely individual. There is no doubt about it. But as soon as we translate them into consciousness, they do not appear so any longer. This is the proper phenomenalism and perspectivism as I understand it. The nature of animal consciousness involves the notion that the world of which we can become conscious is only a superficial and symbolic world, a generalized and vulgarized world, that everything which becomes conscious becomes just thereby shallow, meager, relatively stupid, a generalization, a symbol, a characteristic of the herd, that with the evolving of consciousness there is always combined a great radical perversion, falsification, superficialization, and generalization." End quote. So the eponymous genius of the species in this passage, we might say, you could use genius in the same sense as spirit, right? The spirit of the species, because the meaning of genius here is much the same as the New Testament Christians would have thought of the spirit. And insofar as consciousness, which is created out of the necessity of communication, takes all of those altogether personal, unique, and absolutely individual thoughts and sentiments and sensations, which are subjective and incomparable, which are not equal to the thoughts and sentiments and sensations of others, and equates them. How does it do this? Well, primarily through language. I think Nietzsche would argue that on some level, conceptual formation even more fundamentally vulgarizes. But we don't need to get into that here. I mean, we can get at it through talking about language, because language, like number, is the equation of unequal things, as Nietzsche says in another passage we'll look at in a little while. But we might think of Wittgenstein's thought experiment of a man who has a sensation for which he does not know the word and for which perhaps no word exists. Wittgenstein imagines this person recording every instance of this sensation, every time they feel this sensation, and they indicate it by the letter S. And S here is simply a variable. It's a stand-in. The way we would use the letter X in an equation, right? It's an unknown quantity. But naturally, the hypothetical person in this thought experiment soon encounters a problem. After a couple of days of recording his S's in his journal, he soon has the sensation, or what he thinks is the sensation, but he can no longer remember whether the sensation he's having is actually the same as the previous sensations that he has marked with the letter S. That is to say that the only anchor for the designation of a given phenomenon, when the only anchor for that is our own subjectivity, when the only way of anchoring the way we indicate in this case, a feeling or a sensation, is to be found with one subjective individual, we soon run into a problem, insofar as sensation is not always a thing with clear boundaries. That's not always something so easily disentangled from other sensations. It's not always so easy to recognize. People speak of bittersweet feelings, for instance, of a kind of happiness infused with melancholy, or a sadness that makes them feel tenderness and sympathy. Or we can imagine anger, like perhaps righteous anger, can be pleasurable, or a very common phrase of a love-hate relationship. Feelings are rarely pure and unadulterated. They're often an admixture. And that's just another way of stating the problem that feelings have unclear boundaries. Another way of looking at it would be, for example, somebody who feels depressed. You would be hard-pressed often to locate the beginning of their depression at a single day. I mean, some people have personal calamities that lead to depression, right? But if somebody just has clinical depression, usually it's not going to be that they can source that feeling to an exact moment, to the minute where they became depressed. I mean, to ask that is somewhat of an absurd question, right? When was the exact minute on the exact day that you first started becoming depressed? Usually they find even if they come into awareness of the feeling at a certain point, that they proceeded into the state day by day, hour by hour, insensibly, imperceptibly. And it becomes very hard to say exactly when it, quote unquote, arrives. Where does one feeling end and another begin? Part of the problem is that feelings aren't objects in the first place. It's more like a happening or a process, you might say. So it's not, when speaking of the feeling as though it arrives, speaking of it as though it is an it, right? Even that might not be permitted. But, given that, another problem, so much of what we are quote unquote feeling has to do with where our attention is going, and 1,000 physiological factors, a bunch of circumstances we might not even notice. But it's also not unreasonable to imagine someone thinking they're feeling one way, but very quickly realizing that the feeling was false. I thought I was livid with rage, but really I just needed to eat something, right? Many people have had that experience. Or I thought I was hopelessly depressed, but that was when I was sitting at home by myself with just my own thoughts for company. And once I was distracted from all those thoughts by a good meal and good company with friends, suddenly I don't feel as depressed. And one could say, well, perhaps the feeling is still there. You've just distracted yourself from it. But what is the existence of a sensation other than being there, so to speak, right? What is it to speak of a sensation that's not sensed? And a latent sensation is not sensed. A feeling that we're not aware of is not felt. So the very fact that that a lot of the way we feel has to do with where our attention is going and paying attention to the feeling, and the fact that if we move our attention, the feeling goes away, again, calls into question the sort of concrete reality of the feeling, the difficulty of pinning it down within our subjectivity and being absolutely sure that we know exactly what we're speaking of when we speak about our own experiences in these generalized terms that are, that I've had to invoke throughout this to sort of get across the problematizing that somebody like Nietzsche would be trying to make. And so Wittgenstein's conclusion with his thought experiment is that in so many words, we don't have a good enough memory to have a designation for a purely private sensation, one which only the individual subject is aware of. We're not reliable enough in the individual level. And yet, we do speak of feelings, we do speak of sensations. So on what basis do we do that? Well, none of us have access to the individual subjectivity of others. I mean, I can't say, I felt happy, and we have this machine where I can inhabit your subjective experience for a moment, and I can see that what you're feeling and what I have felt are the same thing by way of comparison. We can never make that comparison. That's not available within the current range of experiences possible for human beings. Maybe the transhumanists will have something to say about that, but I'm personally skeptical that we could ever overcome our skepticism, and discussing that further might take us too far afield. But it would be very hard to actually know that you actually were inhabiting the subjective experience of another human being, even if you had the subjective experience of that happening. But in any case, we might say, what is it that really designates a feeling like happiness or melancholy, supposing that we cannot make that comparison? We can't be certain that my experience equates to yours. In fact, when we indicate a feeling, we are using a universal symbol, what Nietzsche would say is a vulgarized, generalized symbol, for something we can never know is actually generalizable. All we have is our attempt to approximate the feeling in words, and these words are, at the end of the day, the same thing as saying S, right, or saying X. It's just a placeholder. It's a linguistic utterance that refers to a phenomenon. And we all agree by convention that this indicator, joy or anger or whatever, refers to that state. But really, what are we actually referring to? Not so much the inner content of the person, which we can never access, but a series of external symptoms that we come to recognize and then generalize from. There are many parallels to Wittgenstein in the passage in The Gay Science, but I would say that the most important one is that the assertion that consciousness is an artifact of the human necessity for communication, that leads Nietzsche to this idea that the dependency on one another it's required human beings to be able to communicate, and in order to fulfill that requirement, we create a surface and sign world, as he calls it, of consciousness. And that is the main similarity, as I see it, to Wittgenstein, that Nietzsche severs off the concern with language as a way of approximating the truth or corresponding to the truth, that he sees language effectively as fulfilling the necessities of communication, which would be, at the end of the day, survival necessities, if we were to put it in Darwinian terms. But we might just say that it suits the advantage of a form of life that can communicate and therefore coordinate, is better off than a life form that can't. And so the idea that what language is doing and what our concept formation is doing, because the concept formation as a thing going on in consciousness would, under this model, under this understanding, also be geared towards communication from the very start. So what it's actually doing, because we can never touch the inner subjectivity, so to speak, that's not an option. What we do is so it's a surface world because it merely approximates that inner subjective world according to external symptoms. And it's a sign world because then we use these linguistic signs to indicate aspects of inner subjectivity, but because all we have is the external symptoms, these inevitably vulgarize and generalize. And so we might consider, in addition to this, the importance attributed to the Logos in Christianity. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made by it, and without it was not made anything that was made. You know, in that passage at the beginning of the book of John, you can see the development of Greek thought was already sort of pushing towards this conclusion for many centuries. That in some sense, the message of Jesus is the fulfillment of the Greek idea of the Logos, the fulfillment of the promise that language is a productive, creative, powerful force. But we have to really take seriously what that actually means. That consciousness and communication and language are in some intimate sense deeply related, to the point of inseparability. That to speak of consciousness without speaking of communication is somewhat incomprehensible. And while, it's at least comprehensible to speak of communication without language, that doesn't really account for the truth of the human condition. The intelligible world is a world of word concepts. It's a world of generalized and generalizable symbols. These cannot refer to the deep, profound, incommunicable inner reality of the human being, but instead they refer to conventions, and they refer to conventions specifically of grouping together certain things based on the surface and the symptoms. And so this idea goes way back with Nietzsche. I mean, the other passage that I wanted to mention, he writes of this in On Truth and Lies in the Non-Moral Sense, and he actually extends the argument beyond mere inner states. He says this argument applies to all concepts, even to our concepts that designate classes of external objects. Nietzsche raises a problem even here. Quote, "Every word instantly becomes a concept precisely insofar as it is not supposed to serve as a reminder of the unique and entirely individual original experience to which it owes its origin, but rather a word becomes a concept insofar as it simultaneously has to fit countless more or less similar cases, which means, purely and simply, cases which are never equal and thus altogether unequal. Every concept arises from the equation of unequal things. Just as it is certain that one leaf is never totally the same as another, so it is certain that the concept leaf is formed by arbitrarily discarding these individual differences and by forgetting the distinguishing aspects. This awakens the idea that, in addition to the leaves, there exists in nature the leaf, the original model according to which all the leaves were perhaps woven, sketched, measured, colored, curled, and painted, but by incompetent hands, so that no specimen has turned out to be a correct, trustworthy, and faithful likeness of the original model. We call a person honest, and then we ask, why has he behaved so honestly today? Our usual answer is on account of his honesty. Honesty. This in turn means that the leaf is the cause of the leaves. We know nothing whatsoever about an essential quality called honesty, but we know of countless individualized and consequently unequal actions which we equate by omitting the aspects in which they are unequal and which we now designate as honest actions. Finally, we formulate from them a qualitas occulta which has the name honesty. We obtain the concept, as we do the form, by overlooking what is individual and actual, whereas nature is acquainted with no forms and no concepts, and likewise with no species, but only with an X, which remains inaccessible and undefinable for us. Even our contrast between individual and species is something anthropomorphic and does not originate in the essence of things." End quote. So once again, we have this sense of the equation of the unequal as the basis of generalization, of universalizations of any given phenomenon. And Nietzsche takes this beyond mere inner experience, but to outer sensations as well. And lest anyone think that this is just sort of well, that's just an argument to say that, are you saying that anyone's experience of reality is as good as anyone else's? You can say anything you want and it doesn't matter, the truth of it, or something like that. People always get very sort of, suspicious of arguments like this. But I think if you're paying attention, what kind of statement would that be? To say that any experience of reality is as good as any other? That would be another equation, an attempt to equalize experience, say that my experience is just as valid as the next. And that goes precisely against Nietzsche's point. So anyone who takes the argument in that direction is not really paying attention. The point is not that there are no leaves. We can go outside and look at the trees and study the individual leaves and their branches, right? Nietzsche's pointing out that the word concept, the general category of leaf that you've created, is something you created and you're imposing on that reality. But, it's not as if to say that it's just as valid to say that the trees have leaves versus somebody who to say, no, the trees have feathers, right? That's not the argument at all. It's that each of those categories is something added onto a phenomenal reality, which is, in its purest form, unmediated, unmistakable. What Nietzsche's criticizing is the abstraction of that concrete, immediate, phenomenal experience, which is just really visual data that your eyes see, abstracting that into a general category. That's what Nietzsche says is this error in thought. And he's also not saying that these errors might not be necessary for life. Maybe we have to create such generalizations in order to reason at all. If every subjective experience were to be held in its absolute, uncommunicable uniqueness, no communication would be possible. We'd all be like Wittgenstein's man, jotting down our signs and symbols for our experiences without any common convention between us for talking about them, and thus no potential communication. And that's just the thing. We're reorienting our view to see the utility of consciousness, the necessity for us as just what types of beings we are. And that's what we should understand the consciousness as providing, not a facsimile of a quote-unquote true world. And that's, Nietzsche diverges from the conventional opinion, and he diverges from philosophical opinion for thousands of years in questioning the truth basis of the abstraction, arguing that it is precisely at the point of investing these generalizations with universal reality that we go astray. And that's his great crusade against the supposed truthfulness of language, and against the conception of philosophy as disinterested truth-seeking, and against the notion that what the consciousness provides us is a correspondence to a quote-unquote objective, mind-independent reality. That in fact, how could you have an experience of mind-independent reality? Every experience that you have is dependent on your mind. Experience itself is dependent on the mind. We see by means of the human head and cannot cut it off, and what would remain over if it had been cut off? Implication being nothing. That quite literally all the data we have is filtered through the human mind. And so it will ever remain an abstraction, the reality in absentia of the human mind. And so what we have is our conventions. And we have these because they're useful, and for Nietzsche, that's a reality we must accept. So, now to return to that concept in the Antichrist, that where Nietzsche flips soul and spirit on their heads. He switches their places, he reverses them. That's the subversive nature of that passage that I really want to bring out. But there's one final thing I want to talk about, because you might be wondering about soul at this point. Nietzsche has no problem invoking the soul, Seele in German. He does it numerous times throughout Zarathustra and in his dithyrambic poems. And he often uses the term soul to refer to the inner life of the thinker. And there's one particularly illuminating passage in Beyond Good and Evil. We'll take a look at this, actually. This is in section 12 of Book 1 on the Prejudices of Philosophers, because this passage makes clear that he does mean to hold on to the idea of the soul. but he wants to redefine it according to his new understanding of what the individual is. Quote, "The belief which regards the soul as something indestructible, eternal, indivisible, as a monad, as an atomon, this belief ought to be expelled from science. Between ourselves, it is not at all necessary to get rid of the soul thereby, and thus renounce one of the oldest and most venerated hypotheses, as happens frequently to the clumsiness of naturalists who can hardly touch on the soul without immediately losing it. But the way is open for new conclusions and refinements of the soul hypothesis, and such conceptions as mortal soul, and soul of subjective multiplicity, and soul as social structure of the instincts and passions want henceforth to have legitimate rights in science." End quote. And so, for Nietzsche, the individual is a unity and a multiplicity, an oligarchy of drives. Sometimes the drives compete, sometimes they cooperate. And the soul, as he describes it here, is not an atom, which means it's not indivisible. It's not a core. It's not the enduring, indestructible core of the self. That's why he takes pains to say it's not immortal. Rather, the soul is something that is an impermanent phenomenon, which is an aggregate. It's something made out of the totality of drives. In fact, the soul, like all concepts, is the equation of unequal things yet again. And this is an age-old problem in establishing a sort of logical basis of self-identity, which the Buddhists raised this some 2,500 years before the time of Nietzsche, that when we invoke our identity, we invoke a variety of things which are, for one, not themselves identical, and then usually what the self is made up of are well, the Buddhists call them skandhas, or heaps, aggregates, basically. So like the body, the consciousness, sensations, and so on. All of these have variously been called the seat of the self, or in some combination. But the Buddhists studiously argue that each one of these things is made up of smaller things, none of which is self-identical, none of which are enduring or immortal and indivisible. In fact, every single one of these things are divisible, right? So you can't ever find the atom. You can't ever find the bedrock. You can't find the grounding for where the self exists and say, yes, it exists there. It's sort of an emergent property from non-identical things, which means the designation is somewhat arbitrary. This is not so much a problem for Nietzsche's soul, however, because he's sort of called into question all words are arbitrary in that way, or all word concepts. And the nature of Nietzsche's soul is that it, in fact, capitulates to all of these aspects, that it is divisible, right? Nietzsche is fine with saying the self is a series of aggregates, a series of unequal things confounded under one label, so long as we understand that that's really what the term soul designates. But if he did have to pick one of those things that the Buddhists say, well, that can't be the self, he would say it's the body. Now, I should also say Nietzsche's not married to any of this language, because, a few passages later, he speaks of oversouls and undersouls. And then he makes the claim, quote, "Our body is but a social structure composed of many souls," end quote. So, given that he's defined the self as a multiplicity and a unity, there's not really a fundamental contradiction here insofar as the self or the soul, whichever term we use to call it, that is itself a contradiction. And so we end up describing it in contradictory terms. But so let's notice what Nietzsche has done to the soul. He's located it as the place of these mental and emotional realities, the place of desires, of unconscious notions, of valuations, and so on. The soul is the place where the deep sensations occur, where that uncommunicable and absolutely personal you exists, right? That's the realm towards which he's been gesturing in all of these passages so far. But the Christian has in some ways located much of what Nietzsche places in the soul within the spirit. The Christian understanding of the soul is that that's the consciousness, that's the seat of one's being, the foundation of that being. Their conception of the spirit, again, is not individual. It's distributed throughout the world. It's like the wind or the breath. And in the sense of the Holy Spirit, it is in every Christian. It's this animated force or animating force associated with God, and God is omnipresent. And so spirit is this distributed thing. That's where all that is sort of within all of us. That's from where wills, impulses, drives, values, these sort of things come, or where they are stirred. Whereas the consciousness is associated with the individuality and the individual subject, right? Nietzsche's understanding is the other way around. That in fact, consciousness ought to be correlated with spirit. Consciousness is the thing that is a communal possession, that exists for the sake of communication in the communal. The consciousness is what exists as a common property, as a force distributed in multiple individuals. And the drives, the desires, these things, they're in the soul for Nietzsche. That's what's individual and uncommunicable. And so this is the nature of his harsh critique of pure spirit in the Antichrist number 14. On the one hand, it's Nietzsche committing the one unforgivable sin of blaspheming the Holy Spirit. But for our purposes, the interesting element of his argument is insofar as he attempts to rewire our associations with the Spirit. What the Christian sort of gets wrong by locating desire and drive within the Spirit, within the intelligible world, within that shared immaterial reality, is that the drives actually come from the physiology. They come from the body. They come from a physiological origin. Nietzsche says the Christian dismisses this body as merely the mortal coil or as a shell or a vessel. For the Christian, the body is the surface. The body is what's superficial. We've all heard the saying that beauty is only skin deep. It's a very Christian sentiment. And of course, the Christian believes they'll leave behind their earthly body and be given a new, perfect body in heaven. But Nietzsche, in this passage, in Antichrist 14, that we read at the beginning, he says, if you remove the body and you aimed only for spirit, nothing would remain over. Or rather, what would remain would be, in truth, pure surface, pure sign, that they have it backwards. The world of spirit, that's the surface and sign world. But that's where we have all the concepts that have populated the Christian world of spirit. The abstractions, such as goodness and blessedness and virtue and charity and chastity and humility and so on. That's the vulgarized, generalized world. It's really a world of Platonic forms, which is why Christianity is, for Nietzsche, a development on Platonism. Plato's form of the good becomes a personal God in this innovation. But other than the imputation of consciousness to this form, right, there's not much difference that has changed in the final analysis between the form of the good and God. The person who aims to live in pure spirit lives in this Platonic world, but fails to realize that without the body, without those unconscious drives, without those unnameable and uncommunicable sensations and impulses, he himself would not exist. The subject would not exist. His soul, so to speak, would not exist. Because the soul, for Nietzsche, is not the seat of consciousness. That's the place of the unconscious. The real root, the real foundation of the individual is in the unconscious operations of the body. There's a passage in Daybreak where Nietzsche says that the consciousness is a commentary on an unknown text. And now that we've developed our understanding of this idiosyncratic Nietzschean reversal of the terms soul and spirit, perhaps we could translate it as saying, or we could say it's the equivalent of saying, the world of spirit is a commentary on the unknown soul. And this is why pure spirit is pure stupidity, because it would be a commentary on no text at all. And so often it seems as if Christians wished there were no text at all, no body at all, just as there have been strains of quite literal iconoclasm that have swept the Christian world from time to time. Christians, I would say, practice a form, if the body is a text, right, then Christians practice a form of metaphorical book burning when it comes to the text of the body, not wanting to acknowledge the physiological, unconscious, unmotivated, and therefore totally amoral and totally out of our control origins of so many of the things that make us up, that make up the soul. Now, there are many different threads of argument in the Antichrist and many different reasons for Nietzsche's attack on Christianity that we haven't talked about here. I did a two-parter on the Antichrist way back in season 1, and we talked about, in breaking down that whole text, the critique of pity. Pity is harmful to life. The critique of Jesus as pathologically sensitive. The comparison between Christianity and Buddhism, or Christianity and Islam. And those elements are no less important. But the reason why I wanted to talk about this aspect here in such detail is that this critique runs through all of Nietzsche's work. It constitutes one of his most profound problems with Christianity, but it traces all the way back to Platonism. And that is the overvaluation of consciousness and the misunderstanding of the consciousness. The error of thinking of the consciousness as the place of depth and profundity, whereas to Nietzsche, the unconsciousness, the soul which is a multiplicity, an inner chaos which is not indivisible, not coherent, that's the place of profundity. And that's where everything springs from, the soil out of which everything we are grows out of this unconscious world. And consciousness, to Nietzsche, is a false and deceptive world. It is, in fact, a facsimile, a simulacrum, which is already sort of a strike against it. It's not a perfect, mirroring of reality. But what is it a facsimile of? Does it correspond to an objective, mind-independent reality? No, it's a facsimile of this profound inner world of really pure sensation, feeling, so on and so forth. And with this, I think we can refer back to that great anti-metaphysical about face that Nietzsche performs during this time in his career, the denial of the so-called true world and the willingness to stop courageously at the surface, at the appearance, to declare we live in a world of appearances. And while Plato would hold that the sensations and the world of appearances and bodies is a false world that has to be overcome by means of the conscious intellect, Nietzsche holds that the world of the conscious intellect is not so much that it needs to be overcome, but to sort of flip the way we see it, that this is an added-on world. Nietzsche puts it this way in The Genius of the Species, quote, "The whole of life would be possible without its seeing itself, as it were, in a mirror. As, in fact, even at present, the far greater part of our life still goes on without this mirroring, and even our thinking, feeling, volitional life as well, however painful the statement may sound to an older philosopher," end quote. So, whereas the metaphysical ambitions of philosophers of past ages had them straining their intellect in order to peer behind the world of appearances, the world as it appears to us, behind the embodied world, the world that takes place in our mind, Nietzsche says that that metaphysical striving doesn't lead to the discovery of a world beyond the appearance. It is the invention of one. It is a world mirrored in consciousness, but that world of consciousness is a world of generalized signs that approximates reality, falsifies it, oversimplifies away the contradictions, equates the unequal. And so the Platonist says, my sensation only sees what is in front, and my intellect is peering behind it, right? Nietzsche says, my sensation is here on earth, in reality, grounded, experiencing this reality, and my intellect is up in the clouds. Consciousness is up in the clouds, taken up in a flight of fancy, taking you away from the reality. It doesn't peer behind the veil and show you a truer reality. It takes you up into abstraction. And this, of course, it has some mind-boggling implications for Nietzsche's philosophy if you apply much of this to himself, because like all the rest of us, he has to communicate this to us in the form of word concepts, meaning that Nietzsche must generalize, he has to abstract, he has to vulgarize. And he rages against this reality, but nevertheless he must employ it as he is a writer. And when he makes a claim like, we all have these incommunicable, absolutely unique experiences, how does he know that? I mean, ultimately he doesn't. For all he knows, the rest of humanity does have experiences which are communicable and which can be indicated linguistically with perfect adequacy. And even if we are to say that Nietzsche is correct, that would be just as problematic, because that would mean that he's managed to succeed in conveying his meaning through this surface and sign world, right? That through his words, he's managed to give us a glimpse into his allegedly incommunicable inner thoughts and feelings. Either way, it's really a contradiction. That quandary has troubled many philosophers over the years, from Heraclitus to Lao Tzu to Nagarjuna to Maimonides to Wittgenstein. And many of them eventually give in and sort of throw up their hands in the face of the inadequacy of language, and a lot of them make that inevitable turn to mysticism. Some of those philosophers I mentioned are religious philosophers from the start, but that, in my view, is sort of, there's a great pipeline from philosopher to mystic, and it comes through this perception of the paradoxes of language, so to speak. Perhaps one of the most admirable things about Nietzsche is that he never throws himself into that mystical view. He doesn't say with the Zen Buddhists, the essence of truth is beyond words and letters. He doesn't embrace quietism. He doesn't become a Christian, chalk it all up to a holy mystery. He remains, as ever, a materialist. And I use that term, materialist, with all the appropriate qualifications, which you ought to know if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time. Or does he, right? Of course, Carl Jung would have alleged the figure of Zarathustra was an archetype within Nietzsche's psyche, that Zarathustra was the wise old man emerging as a kind of compensation for the death of God. Zarathustra takes on the mantle of a new prophet in Nietzsche's imagination, but he's actually sort of an autonomous subpersonality. And in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, in that work, Nietzsche writes lyrically, and he has one foot in philosophy and another foot in poetry. Another aspect is that he will openly ruminate on the fact that it's only through being poetic that he can really convey the truths he wishes to convey. And that is another way of trying to get around this age-old problem, because the poet in many ways is like a mystic. He sort of allows his inspiration to come from places unknown. He allows himself to be irrational. He lets his drives speak freely without the need to confine them in a logical system. This poses its own problem because, as Homer tells us, and as Zarathustra repeats, the poets can't be trusted either. Why would that be? Well, because unless we are to adopt the Greek attitude that the poet's insights really do come from a muse, ultimately it's just a drive speaking in its own form of reasoning. And so poetry might be a more honest deception, and that the poet realizes he's closer to the mystic. But, it's still a deception. Importantly, though, Nietzsche thinks philosophers fall victim to this too. And just to pull up one final quote from Beyond Good and Evil, he says the philosophers, quote, all pose as though their real opinions had been discovered and attained through the self-evolving of a cold, pure, divinely indifferent dialectic, in contrast to all sorts of mystics who are more honest and doltish and talk of inspiration, end quote. So to conclude, we should say Nietzsche should never expect to square that circle. Neither should we, because even this paradoxical nature of conscious communication that we're pointing at, the fact that we only have recourse to a false world of signs and symbols in order to convey meaning, that itself is part of the inadequacy of consciousness and a reason for Nietzsche's distrust of it. If there is any Christmas message, or we'll say any Christmas gift that I could give to my audience, it would be another reversal in that way, right? This Christmas, my gift to you is to take something away, or at least hopefully place you on guard, make you a person of more suspicion as regards the world of consciousness, to see it as a world of errors and falsehoods and oversimplifications and approximations and anthropomorphisms and abstractions and flights of fancy, as Nietzsche does. Because, as Nietzsche says, life would go on quite unaffected without it, and presumably all life did for millions of years, and even now we do in many ways, in that the greater portion of our life, the operations of our body, and even things going on inside of our psyche are not within our conscious awareness, if not at all times, sometimes not at all, right? And in fact, perhaps Nietzsche's most radical claim is that consciousness was not an innovation at all, therefore, but a degeneration, right? The more conscious we become, the worse off we are. And that's one place where I personally don't follow Nietzsche, or where I would at least suggest that I think the Nietzsche of Zarathustra is more helpful than the Nietzsche of the Antichrist. Because in Zarathustra, one gets the sense that whatever problems consciousness may have caused, it's never an option to undo what has been done. Our goal ought to be to aim for a form of consciousness which doesn't fall victim to these old habits, or is a consciousness that has become aware of itself and what it is. And perhaps that is part of Nietzsche's purpose in not discarding the word soul, but redefining it. He doesn't denigrate language and become a quietist. Rather, he uses language to undermine our faith in it. And he says, in Beyond Good and Evil, he could repeat it 100 times, quote, we really ought to free ourselves from the misleading significance of words, end quote. So perhaps Nietzsche's hope would be that we could reach a place at which we can use words without the words using us, that we could one day recognize language for what it is, utilize it, don't be misled, and whether that's possible or likely is anyone's guess. But it was the best thing I could come up with as a gift to give all of you in celebration of the holidays. So thank you for joining me for this short and sweet Christmas special. It was 50 minutes long. A lot of people would say that's not very short, but it's short relative to many episodes of the podcast. Merry Christmas, everyone, and Happy New Year. I hope everyone is able to enjoy their share of holiday cheer this year. if you can, see your family, see your friends, feast and be merry, exchange gifts, kiss someone you're in love with under the mistletoe, do all of that. Make it a Christmas worthy of living once more and innumerable times more. And join me again next week. The podcast is back. We'll be back on New Year's Eve. And as I said, the original episode planned for the return was going to be Shiran, and I didn't intend for it to be a depressing one. That was just the first thing on the schedule that I'd laid out for myself, and I thought it would be fairly... I'm very familiar with Shiran's work, and so it was very easy for me to produce that episode. I don't know, as of recording this episode, whether that will be the New Year's episode or whether I will come up with another... whether I'll swap a different one to be the New Year's episode. I don't know. We'll see. Because Shiran might still be a little bit hardcore for the New Year's Eve episode. But either way, the podcast is back. I'm glad to have all of you here listening with me, and there will be more regular episodes of the season coming soon. Thanks very much, everyone. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.